The Tennessee Miller brothers, who lived alone, called their grist mill cellar a breeding cellar. 28 young maids went missing on their property in the Appalachian Hills. Girls got jobs at the mill and then never came back. The sheriff didn't care that the town knew, and the Miller brothers kept grinding their grain while something much worse was going on below. Anna was the last to go. Eliza, her sister, found her journal hidden under some loose floorboards. The last entry talked about how they were lured to that cellar, where the brothers whispered about bloodlines and purity. The medical supplies came in the middle of the night. Before dawn, people took away heavy crates, but the most terrifying thing they found out wasn't what the brothers were doing to these women. It was why they called it their breeding cellar and the sick family secret that made them do it. What happens when a whole town chooses to stay quiet instead of listening to the screams coming from under a grist mill? The fall of 1877 settled over the Tennessee hills like a shroud, thick with the smell of dead leaves and secrets that grew in the mountain hollows. Eliza Whitmore stood at the window of her kitchen, watching the morning mist cling to the valley below. Her hands shook as she held the letter that had come back to her, the one that had broken what little hope she had left. Anna's name was written carefully on the envelope, but the words "addressee unknown" in harsh red ink across the front made her blood run cold. Anna had been missing for 3 weeks. She had worked as a maid at the Miller brothers' grist mill before she disappeared. 3 weeks of sleepless nights and prayers that went unanswered. For 3 weeks, she told herself that her younger sister was just too busy with her new job to write or send word home. But the letter that came back told a completely different story, one that Eliza had been too scared to admit until now. Since Anna left, she had written her a dozen times. Each letter was full of news from home and gentle reminders to be careful in the remote area where the Miller brothers did business. Anna had promised to write every Sunday without fail, and she always kept her word. But not a single letter had come, not one word to ease the growing knot of fear that had settled in Eliza's chest. Seeing her own handwriting on the envelope that had been sent back confirmed what she had been afraid of. Something terrible had happened to her sister. The Miller brothers were wealthy men in a place where wealth and kindness were both hard to come by. Jedediah and Silas Miller inherited the grist mill from their father. It was the only one for miles around. They also got the large piece of land that ran along the creek bottom, where the water ran dark and fast. People in the hollow knew them as men who kept to themselves and did their work quickly, but not with much warmth. Farmers and housewives came to their mill from as far away as 20 miles to have their corn ground into meal. They had to make the dangerous trip through the mountain passes. Even though the Miller brothers were very successful, there was something about them that made people stop talking when they came to town. Jedediah, the older of the two, had pale, calculating eyes that looked like winter ice. Silas, the younger brother, had a smile that never quite reached his eyes. They paid well for help around the mill, more than most people could afford. This made their job offers very appealing to young women from poor families. Anna was overjoyed when they offered her the job. She saw it as a way to make enough money to help support their sick mother, and maybe even save a little for her own future. Eliza had doubts about the plan from the start, but she had trouble putting her finger on why. Maybe it was the way Silas looked at Anna when he came to talk about the job. He looked at her face and body for too long. Or maybe it was just that the mill was in a remote area, with the nearest neighbor living more than a mile away. But Anna had been so excited and determined to show that she could do things on her own that Eliza pushed her worries aside and wished her sister well. Eliza felt the full weight of her failure to protect the person she loved most in the world as she looked at that damning envelope. She had let Anna go into that wild place by herself, trusting the word of men she didn't know very well. And now her sister was gone, as if the ground had opened up and swallowed her whole. Eliza's walk to Sheriff Brody's office took her through the center of their small town. She passed the general store, where old men talked about the weather and the price of grain, and the church where Reverend Morrison preached about how important it is to accept God's will without question. As she walked by, she nodded to her neighbors and saw how their eyes slid away from hers and how conversations stopped when she got close. In a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, word had already gotten out about Anna's absence. But instead of worry, Eliza felt something else in their averted gazes, a kind of willful ignorance. as if they had all agreed not to see what was happening right in front of them. Sheriff Brody greeted her with the same mix of impatience and condescension that he showed most women who came to see him. He was in his 50s and had gotten soft around the middle from sitting too much and not doing enough. In a county where serious crime was supposed to be as rare as snow in July, his badge was more for show than for use. He hardly looked at the envelope when Eliza put the returned letter on his desk and told him about her fears. He then gave her the same answer he always does. "Now, Miss Whitmore," he said, leaning back in his chair like a man telling a child something obvious, "you know how these young girls can be. Your sister probably ran off with a traveling man, maybe a peddler or a circuit rider, and forgot all about her responsibilities here at home. It happens all the time, especially with the pretty ones, who want to see the world beyond these hills." Eliza felt like she had been hit when her sister's character was so casually dismissed, but she made herself stay calm. "Anna wouldn't do that, Sheriff. She's not like that, and she wouldn't leave without telling you. I'm sure something has happened to her." Brody's face hardened a little, and Eliza saw something behind his practiced indifference, not worry, but annoyance at being pushed to do something. "Miss Whitmore, I know you're worried about your sister, but I can't just go around accusing good men like the Miller brothers of things based on nothing more than your gut feeling. Those boys run a legitimate business, and I've never had any reason to worry about them." The talk went on for 10 more minutes, but Eliza knew she was wasting her time. Sheriff Brody had already made up his mind that Anna's disappearance wasn't worth looking into, and nothing she could say would change his mind. Eliza felt the first stirrings of a cold, determined rage as she walked back through town with the returned letter in her hand. She would have to find her sister on her own if the law couldn't help her. Eliza went back to Anna's room that night for the first time since her sister left. The small room felt empty and abandoned, without the warmth that Anna had always brought to their small home. Eliza moved slowly through the familiar space, running her fingers over Anna's few things: a hairbrush with strands of golden hair still stuck in the bristles, a worn copy of poetry that their mother had given her years ago, and a small mirror that now only showed emptiness. Eliza noticed something strange about the floorboards when she knelt down next to Anna's small bed. One of the boards near the head of the bed was a little higher than the others, as if someone had just moved it. With her heart racing, she ran her fingers along the edges until the board came loose and revealed a small, hollow space below. Inside was Anna's private journal, a thin, leather-bound book that Eliza had never heard of before. She opened the journal with shaking hands and started to read. Anna's early entries were full of her usual excitement and optimism about her new job. She wrote about how big the mill was, how much money she would make, and how she hoped to save enough money to buy their mother the medicine she needed for her cough that wouldn't go away. Anna talked about the Miller brothers with careful respect in the first few weeks. She said that Jedediah was serious, and Silas was more friendly, but she also said that she felt a little uncomfortable when Silas watched her work. The tone of the entry started to change as Eliza kept reading. Anna wrote about strange noises coming from under the mill at night. It was a low moaning sound that seemed to come from the ground itself. She said that the brothers would leave her alone in the house for hours at a time, and they told her not to go into certain parts of the building. The most worrying thing was what Anna heard the brothers talking about when they thought she couldn't hear them. They talk about bloodlines and purity. Anna had written with a shaking hand. Jedediah talks about their father's work and how it must go on. Silas nods along, but I can see fear in his eyes sometimes, as if he wishes he could leave, but knows he can't. They showed me a locked door that leads to what they call the breeding cellar, and when I asked about it, Silas just smiled, that awful smile, and said, "You would understand soon enough." The last entry, which was written just 2 days before Anna's last letter home, was hard to read. The words, "written in a hurry and with fear." They came to me tonight and said there was a sick animal in the cellar that needed tending. They insisted I come with them, despite my protests. Jedediah carried a lantern and Silas had rope in his hands. I cannot shake the feeling that something dreadful is about to happen. If anyone reads this, know that I tried to run, but there is nowhere to go in these hills. The brothers know every path, every hiding place. I pray that God will protect me, but I fear." The entry ended abruptly, the pen trailing off the page as if Anna had been interrupted mid-sentence. Eliza sat in the darkening room, holding the journal to her chest as the full horror of her sister's situation hit her. Anna didn't run away with a traveling man. She was trapped, scared, and finally taken by the same men who had promised her honest work and fair pay. Eliza left for the grist mill the next morning, her mind racing with ideas and plans. She would go there pretending to have corn to grind, which was a good reason for her to be there and look for Anna. As she climbed higher into the hills, the paths she took became more and more isolated. The air in the fall was fresh and clean, but Eliza didn't feel better when she saw the leaves changing color or heard the call of migrating birds in the distance. She was getting closer to the place where her sister had disappeared with every step, and her fear grew with every mile. The mill itself was a big, impressive building made of rough-hewn logs and fieldstone. A huge water wheel turned by the creek. The machines made a sound that seemed to echo through the hollow, drowning out all other sounds and making the place feel heavy and almost hellish. Eliza could see movement behind the windows of the small house where the brothers lived, but there was no sign of Anna or any other woman. Smoke was coming out of the chimney. Jedediah Miller came out of the mill just as Eliza was getting there. He looked at her with cold, calculating interest in his pale eyes. He was tall and thin, with hair that was gray before its time, and hands that were always dirty from flour. He nodded without saying anything when she told him she had corn to grind and motioned for her to come inside. The mill's inside was a maze of grinding stones, wooden gears, and grain chutes. A fine layer of flour hung in the air like fog. The noise was so loud that it was hard to talk, but Eliza was able to shout her questions about Anna over the machine noise. Jedediah's answer was short and rude. The girl had worked for them for a short time, but had been unreliable and left without telling them. When Eliza asked for more information, his eyes hardened, and she saw something cold and dangerous behind his polite face. Silas came out of the mill from somewhere deeper, and Eliza noticed how different the two brothers were. Jedediah was strict and unwelcoming, but Silas had a boyish charm about him. He smiled warmly and was polite. He felt bad for Eliza because she was worried about her sister and even offered to help look for her in the area. But he was sure that Anna had come back to town by a different route. While her corn was being ground, Eliza tried to see as much of the mill as she could to find any signs that Anna was there. She saw that some areas were blocked off with heavy wooden barriers, and when she asked about them, the brothers gave each other a knowing look before Jedediah said that those areas were being fixed and were therefore dangerous for visitors. Eliza thought the explanation sounded rehearsed, so she put the information away for later. The most disturbing part was when Silas said he would show her the living quarters where Anna had stayed while she worked there for a short time. The room was clean and empty, with no signs of recent use. But as they stood there together, Silas got too close. His hand brushed against her arm as he pointed out the window that looked down into the hollow. His touch made her skin crawl, and she could see that he was looking at her face and body in a way that was similar to what Anna had written about in her journal. Eliza saw something that made her blood run cold as she was about to leave with the cornmeal. There was a small piece of blue fabric near the mill's foundation that was mostly hidden by weeds. It looked a lot like the dress Anna had on when she left home. As she tried to get a better look, Jedediah appeared next to her out of nowhere, and his presence became threatening in the darkening twilight. The ride home through the darkening hills was a nightmare of racing thoughts and growing fear. Eliza was sure that something bad had happened to Anna at the mill, but she also knew that it would be very hard to prove it. The brothers were well-respected men in the community who had money and power. She was just a worried sister with no proof other than a hidden journal and her own suspicions. But when Eliza got home, she felt something new inside her. A cold, unyielding determination that would not be stopped by fear or social norms. Anna was gone, maybe dead, but her story would not end in silence. Eliza would find out the truth about the Miller brothers and their breeding cellar, no matter what it cost her, and she would make them pay for what they had done. Over the next few weeks, Eliza began her quiet investigation in earnest. She moved through the community like a shadow, asking careful questions and listening for the whispered truths that lived in the spaces between official denials. She began with the families she knew best, the ones whose daughters had worked for rich men and then disappeared into the mountains or run off with strangers, according to stories that had been accepted as true for years. What she found out made her blood run cold. Martha Hensley lived alone in a cabin at the edge of the hollow. Her strange behavior had long made her the subject of suspicion and pity among the more respectable families. But when Eliza sat with her by the flickering light of an oil lamp, Martha's pale eyes were sharp and knowing, and her memories were painfully clear. 7 years ago, her youngest daughter, Rebecca, went to work for the Miller brothers and then disappeared. Martha had never stopped believing that something bad had happened to her child. "They came for her on a Sunday morning," Martha said in a low voice that was hard to hear over the fire. "They said they needed help with the harvest, and that Rebecca could make more money in a month than most girls did in a year." My Rebecca was always drawn to pretty things and good promises, and those Miller boys knew just what to say to get her attention. I begged her not to go and told her there was something wrong with that place, but she wouldn't listen. Martha said that Rebecca wrote home every week for the first few weeks, and her letters were full of excitement about her pay and the nice living conditions. But then the letters stopped coming, and when Martha went to the mill to ask about her daughter, she was told that Rebecca had run away with a traveling merchant who had come through the area. Sheriff Brody was satisfied with the story, but Martha had never believed it for a second. Martha went on. Rebecca would never have left without saying goodbye. She twisted her hands in her lap. She loved me too much for that, even though we fought a lot. But I heard things from people who lived closer to the mill, like strange noises at night that sounded like animals in trouble. And there were the medical supplies, big crates of them coming from the city, way more than 2 healthy men would ever need. The pattern Martha described was too familiar, and as Eliza kept looking into it, she found proof that at least 6 other young women had gone missing in the same way in the last 10 years. Each of them had worked for the Miller brothers. Each had sent hopeful letters home at first, and then each had completely disappeared, leaving behind only official explanations that said their disappearances were due to wanderlust or moral weakness. Eliza's big break came when she went to see Thomas Garrett, the young blacksmith whose forge was at the crossroads between the town and the more remote homesteads. Thomas was a quiet, honest man who had feelings for Anna that he had never been able to tell her about. When Eliza told him what she had found, he went from being calm to barely controlled rage. "I should have said something before," he said, clenching his strong hands into fists as they stood in the smoky workshop. "Miss Whitmore, I've seen things that didn't make sense at the time, but now seem clear as day. The Miller brothers come through here every few weeks to fix horseshoes and do metal work, and they always travel at night. They carry heavy loads, crates, and bundles that they guard carefully, and they pay in gold coin, when most people around here barely have 2 pennies to rub together." Thomas said that he had once seen the brothers loading a big canvas-wrapped bundle into their wagon. The bundle was about the size and shape of a person. Jedediah had looked at him with cold eyes and told him that they were bringing supplies for their milling business when he had asked him casually about their cargo. At the time, the explanation made sense, but now that Eliza has told Thomas what really happened, he sees the meeting in a much more evil light. "There's one more thing," Thomas said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I've worked for them at the mill itself, fixing their machines and things like that. The building has parts that are always locked up, which Jedediah says are dangerous because the foundations aren't stable. But I've noticed that these locked areas have heavy ventilation systems that are much more complicated than what you would need for grain storage. And one time, when I was working late, I heard voices coming from below the mill, but they were muffled, like they were coming from deep underground." With this new information, Eliza started to put together a terrifying picture of what the Miller brothers were up to. The locked rooms, the medical supplies, and the strange noises Anna had written about in her journal all pointed to something much worse than just murder. The brothers weren't just killing these women. They were keeping them alive for some horrible reason that Anna had heard them talk about in connection with their obsession with bloodlines and purity. Eliza was filled with both desperate hope and unbearable pain when she realized that her sister might still be alive, trapped in whatever hell the brothers had made under their mill. Anna and the other women suffered more and more every day, but there was still a chance of rescue if she could find a way to tell the truth and make the authorities do something. But as news of Eliza's investigation spread through the community, more and more people spoke out against her work. People looked at her with suspicion and didn't answer her questions, as if she were a source of infection. Some of this resistance came from fear. People were scared of what might happen to them if they spoke out against the powerful Miller brothers. But some of it came from a darker place. A group choice to stay blissfully ignorant instead of facing the evil that had been growing in their midst. When Eliza got to Thomas's forge one morning and saw that the building had been vandalized overnight, that was the last straw. There were tools all over the floor. The fire had been put out with water, and someone had painted a crude message in red paint that looked like blood on the wall. Mind your own business, or suffer the consequences. Thomas looked at the damage with grim determination, his jaw set in hard lines that made Eliza think of how determined she was. "This just shows we're doing the right thing," he said as he started to fix his workbench that had fallen over. "The Miller brothers are scared, which means they know their time is running out. We just need to find proof that Sheriff Brody can't ignore." But when Eliza saw the damage and the big warning on the wall, she knew that her investigation had just become a lot more important. The brothers were no longer happy with the community's silence and the sheriff's lack of concern. They were ready to use violence to protect their secrets, which meant that anyone who kept looking for the truth was putting their life in danger. As she walked home through the autumn twilight, she couldn't stop thinking about whether her desire to save Anna was strong enough to put the lives of the few friends who had been brave enough to stand by her at risk. 3 nights later, the answer came in a brutal way that destroyed what little hope Eliza had left for a peaceful solution. Thomas was working late in his forge, determined to finish fixing a neighbor's plow before morning. That's when the attack happened. Eliza found him the next morning, unconscious and bleeding in the dirt behind his workshop. His face was so badly beaten that she could barely recognize the kind man who had become her strongest ally. Dr. Hennings, the closest doctor who lived 12 miles away in the county seat, got there by noon and gave his grim report. Thomas would live, but his injuries were bad. His ribs were broken, his cheekbone was shattered, and his left eye was hurt in a way that might never heal properly. It was even more worrying that the attackers had taken their time with the beating, doing it with careful precision to send a message instead of just disabling him. Dr. Henning said to Eliza as they stood next to Thomas's bed in the small room above the forge, "This wasn't random violence. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted him to suffer, and they wanted everyone to know what happens to people who ask too many questions." For the first 2 days, Thomas was in and out of consciousness, mumbling bits of words that Eliza couldn't quite make out. When he finally woke up completely, the first thing he said that made sense was an apology that pierced her heart like a knife. "Sorry, Miss Whitmore," he said in a low voice, his lips swollen, and his good eye having trouble focusing on her face. "I tried to get closer to the mill that night. I thought I might find something that would prove what they're doing down there. But Jedediah and 2 other men, I didn't know, were waiting for me. They were big guys with hard faces and no conscience. They knew I was coming before I even stepped onto their property." Eliza's already broken resolve was shaken even more when she realized that the Miller brothers had known about Thomas's investigation. If they could easily guess what she was going to do and had friends who would hurt people for them, how could she ever hope to bring them to justice? She felt like she was carrying a heavy load because she was responsible for Thomas's suffering. It was even worse because she knew that her search for justice had hurt an innocent man whose only crime was caring about Anna's fate. The news of the attack spread through the community with the speed that only really shocking news can, but instead of anger, Eliza found a wall of silence that was even harder to break than before. The few people who had been willing to tell her what they thought about the Miller brothers now refused to talk to her. They crossed the street when they saw her coming and avoided her eyes in the general store. Even Martha Hensley, who had been so open about her daughter's disappearance, shut herself off from the world in fear, saying through her closed door that she had been wrong about everything and begging Eliza to leave her alone. Sheriff Brody's answer to the attack was exactly what Eliza had thought it would be. A quick investigation that found that Thomas had been beaten by people she didn't know, probably drifters passing through the area, looking for easy targets. When Eliza said the Miller brothers might be to blame, Brody's face turned hard, almost angry. "Miss Whitmore, I've been patient with your crazy claims up until now, but this has gone too far," he said, leaning back in his chair like a man who had had enough. "I won't let you spread lies about the Miller brothers just because you can't accept that your sister left this place. They are respected members of this community. If you keep making these false claims, I will have to think about charging you with disturbing the peace." Eliza knew she had lost her last chance for official help when she heard the threat. The system that was supposed to protect the innocent had instead sided with the criminals, making her feel more alone than ever. She felt like she was carrying the weight of defeat on her shoulders as she walked home from the sheriff's office. Because of what she did, Thomas was broken and in pain. The community had turned against her completely, and Anna was still stuck in whatever hell the Miller brothers had made under their mill. That night, Eliza hit rock bottom emotionally while she was alone in the house that used to be filled with Anna's laughter. She sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the proof she had carefully collected: Anna's journal, the testimonies of grieving families, and Thomas's notes about the brothers' suspicious activities. She realized that none of it meant anything without the bravery of others to speak up and demand justice. The silence that kept the Miller brothers safe was stronger than any proof she could give or any truth she could tell. Eliza let herself really grieve for the first time since Anna went missing. She grieved not only for her sister, but also for the foolish belief that good would win over evil if only someone was brave enough to fight for it. The tears came in loud, painful sobs that seemed to rip something important from her chest, leaving her empty and drained. She had let Anna down, let Thomas down, and let all the other women whose stories had been buried under years of willful ignorance and cowardice. But as the night went on and her tears stopped, something strange started to happen in the emptiness that grief had left behind. It wasn't hope. That weak feeling had been beaten out of her, just like Thomas had been beaten in the dark behind his forge. It was something colder and longer lasting. A quiet understanding that losing didn't always mean giving up. Eliza picked up Anna's journal and started reading it again. This time, though, she didn't pay attention to the evidence it had. Instead, she listened to the voice that spoke from its pages. Anna's words showed that she was a young woman who had faced her fear with dignity and had tried to tell the truth even though she knew it might cost her everything. The last entry, which ended suddenly and had an incomplete sentence, did not show failure but rather courage. The courage to speak out even when faced with unimaginable evil. When the sun came up over the Tennessee hills, Eliza made a choice that would change her life forever. She couldn't save Anna, couldn't fix what had happened to Thomas, and couldn't make a corrupt system give people justice. But there was one thing she could do that the Miller brothers and their friends could never stop. She could make sure that the truth lived on, that the stories of the missing women were kept and honored. Even if justice was always out of reach, the fight wasn't over. It was just changing shape. It went from a desperate search for help to something deeper and more lasting. A promise to remember, to tell the truth, and to believe that some stories are too important to let die in the dark. After her night of reckoning, Eliza began the slow process of changing over the next few weeks. She no longer walked through the community like a desperate woman looking for allies for an impossible cause. Instead, she walked through it with a different and more realistic goal. She began to write down everything with great care, making a detailed record that would serve as both a memorial and an accusation. She carefully wrote down the story of each family and each disappearance, weaving together all the circumstantial evidence into a story that showed the full extent of the Miller brothers' crimes. Thomas, who was slowly getting better from his injuries in the room above his forge, was the first person to change his mind about this new way of doing things. His one good eye burned with fierce approval when she told him her plan. It reminded her why she had trusted him from the start. "You're right," he said, his voice still hoarse from the damage to his throat. "We can't beat them with force or the law, but we can make sure their evil doesn't die with them. Truth is powerful, even when justice fails." As Thomas got stronger, he threw himself into the project with a determination that seemed to come from his injuries rather than weaken them. He started talking to people in the area around him, using his connections as a blacksmith to find other places where young women had gone missing in strange ways. What they found showed that predation was happening in a much larger area than just the remote Tennessee hollow where the Miller brothers worked. After Thomas beat her, Martha Hensley went silent out of fear. As news of their new approach spread, she slowly came out of her shell. One gray morning in early winter, she showed up at Eliza's door with a little wooden box that held everything she had kept of her daughter Rebecca. Letters, a lock of hair, and a small silver locket that had been her most prized possession. Martha's hands shook as she opened the box. "I want her story told right," she said. Not the lies they told about her running away, but the truth about what she was. A good girl who deserved better than what happened to her in that cursed place. When Martha decided to let them remember her daughter, it seemed to break down the wall of silence in the community. Families started to come to them quietly, always at night or in the privacy of their own homes, and share stories and things that had been hidden away for years. Each new piece of information added to the growing record and added another name to the list of women whose disappearances had been explained away by a system that cared more about keeping the peace than getting justice. Dr. Hennings, the doctor who treated Thomas after he was beaten, gave the most important breakthrough. He stayed longer than necessary after checking on the blacksmith's recovery, obviously dealing with some inner conflict. He finally said, "There's something you should know," and then he looked nervously out the window, as if he thought he might see people watching from the shadows. "I've treated 3 other men who were beaten for asking questions about the Miller brothers in the past 5 years. All of them told others to mind their own business or face the same consequences. But there's more to it than that." Dr. Hennings went on to say that Jedediah Miller had asked him several times to buy a lot of medical supplies, like surgical tools, laudanum for pain relief, and other things that made it seem like he needed procedures that were much more complicated than what a simple miller would need. Jedediah had said the supplies were for treating injured animals when he asked what they were for, but the specific items he asked for told a different story. "Obstetrical forceps," Dr. Hennings whispered, his face pale with the implications of what he was saying. "Tools for giving birth and other procedures related to women's reproductive health. No amount of injured livestock would need such specialized tools." The news confirmed Eliza's worst fears about what the Miller brothers were doing in their breeding cellar. However, it also gave her something she had been missing: testimony from a respected professional who could speak to the medical evidence of their crimes. Dr. Hennings agreed to write down what he saw and add it to the growing record, but he insisted that his name not be revealed until it was safe to do so. As winter went on and their documentation project grew, Eliza started to notice small changes in the community around her. People who had completely ignored her after Thomas's beating started to give her cautious nods of recognition when they passed her on the street. People who had stopped talking when she got close to them now spoke in low voices, as if her presence was less scary and more acceptable. The change was slow and not complete, but it showed that their new approach was working better than their old, aggressive ones. Sheriff Brody himself made the biggest change, which was unexpected. The police officer who had ignored Eliza's worries and threatened to arrest her showed up at her door one snowy night in late December. He didn't seem as cocky as usual. Instead, he looked a lot like he was ashamed. He agreed to sit by the fire with her, even though she didn't want to. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about why I was so determined to shut down your investigation. It's not just laziness or corruption, though God knows I've been guilty of both. It's fear, Miss Whitmore, pure, simple fear of what would happen to this community if the truth about the Miller brothers came out." Brody went on to say that he had long suspected that the brothers were involved in the disappearances, but he had convinced himself that keeping society stable was more important than getting justice for a few missing women. The Miller brothers were important employers in the area, and their mill was important to the local economy. Any scandal that put their business out of business would hurt hundreds of innocent families. "I told myself I was protecting the greater good," he said, staring into the flames with empty eyes. "But seeing what they did to young Thomas, and how much fear they've spread through this community, I realize I've been protecting nothing but my own cowardice. Those women deserve better, and so do you." Brody's confession changed the course of their work. They were able to get to official records that had been kept secret with the sheriff's silent help. These records showed the full extent of the brothers' power and the years-long cover-up that had kept them safe. Property transfers, payments to local officials that couldn't be explained, and a pattern of intimidation that went far beyond their immediate victims. All of this was carefully kept in the growing archive that would be their ultimate weapon against the darkness. But Eliza knew that the final fight with the Miller brothers was still going to happen, even though their work was getting better and more people were supporting their cause. As rumors about the investigation spread, the brothers became more and more paranoid, and their reactions to what they thought were threats became more violent and unpredictable. The people in the community might be slowly waking up to the truth, but the people who did it were still free and dangerous, thanks to the network of corruption they had built up over the years and the fact that they lived in a remote area. Eliza knew that the reckoning would come, but it would be very different from what she had first thought. There wouldn't be any individual heroism or dramatic rescue. Instead, there would be something much stronger and longer lasting. The slow, unyielding pressure of a community-wide moral awakening that couldn't be silenced or bought.